All right, so here's a proof using our newfound postulates. So we're given that E is the midpoint of TP and that E is the midpoint of MR, right? So I'm going to start with those as the givens. So point E is the midpoint of segment TP, and E is also the midpoint of segment MR, and the reason is given. All right, so now, when we're given something, let's try to figure out what we can use it for. So when we talk about a midpoint, we're basically saying it's in the middle of, or it cuts the segment into two congruent parts, right? Two equal parts. And so E is the midpoint of TP. So I can use that to say, okay, well, if this is TP, that means E is in the middle, which means that EP must be congruent to TE. Okay, so I can say that TE is congruent to EP, and the reason is definition of midpoint. Okay, so the definition of midpoint says that it's a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. All right, so now that I know those are congruent, I can actually use the definition of midpoint again to say that since E is the midpoint of MR, that means that ME must be congruent to ER, right? So ME, segment ME, must be congruent to segment ER. And for the same reason, right? Okay. So next step. So we have two sides. Now there's a couple ways we can go, right? We know side, side, side. So I could try to prove that RP is congruent to TM. Now I don't see any information that would suggest that just yet. The other way we can go is to get the included angles congruent, right? I could say that angle REP is congruent to angle TEM. So do we have some justification for that? And the answer is we sure do, right? We know that these two angles are congruent because they are a vertical pair, right? So I know that angle TEM is congruent to angle REP. And the reason why is vertical pair, or vertical angles theorem. And you can just say vertical angles are congruent. All right. So now we have enough information to say, okay, side, angle, side on one triangle with side, angle, side on the other, right? So we can use SSS. Okay. And so the statement that we want to make is we want to say one triangle is congruent to the other. So for the first triangle, you can use any order. So I'll use TEM. But for the second triangle, you have to make sure that you have the right corresponding parts, right? So if I put T first, I have to figure, okay, that T corresponds with P, right? It's connected to this congruent part. All right, so T corresponds with P. So I'm going to put P first. Then I'm going to evaluate the E. So E corresponds with E, right? Because angle E is congruent to angle E. And so E is going to be the middle letter there. And so that leaves R corresponding with M. And that makes sense, right? They're both connected to the one with the two tick marks. The segment with the two tick marks. So I'm going to put R there. Okay. So you could do it a different way. You could say MET is congruent with REP, right? Or ERP is congruent with EMT. So there's a few different ways you can do it, but that is our proof. Oh, and one other thing, notice that we didn't have to have the same order when we proved that angles are congruent, right? So this, these angles are interchangeable. If I said MET or TEM, those are the same. So only when you make your your figure congruent statement do you have to make sure that all the parts are the same. Oops. All right.